Hi, everyone. I recently sat down with Kelly Ward, Director of Projects for UNU, a technology leader in the controlled environment agricultural industry, where she helps bring advanced agricultural technology to indoor farms across the world. Kelly and I graduated from Columbia University with our Masters of Public Administration in Development Practice. Kelly is a true expert in the indoor farming sector, so it is my great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Kelly Ward. So, hi, Kelly. Thank you for joining me in this conversation. Really excited about this. You and I, we grew up around traditional farms, correct? Can you talk a little bit about that, about your life around traditional farms growing up and how that inspired and impacted your life and your career?
Yeah. Hello. Thanks for having me. I did grow up around traditional farms. My mother is from a farming family in Prince Edward Island in Canada. So while seeing a lot of the extreme sacrifice and dedication that my family, was offering every single day on the farm, really instilled in me this sense of how important and how difficult farming is. So I actually started myself when I was 9. I started raising sheep, raising livestock. I moved on to working more in vegetables and, leafy greens, that kind of thing. Working on a farm through high school. And it all had a very big impact on me because I started to realize how much of an impact farming had on the environment and the climate. Being up close and personal with it, I realized that with the food system as a whole, farming accounts for about a quarter of greenhouse emissions in the entire world. Obviously, we need farming, right? So it's not like something that we can just get rid of. So how can we then improve it? And so that's what actually kept me into farming. My family got me into it, but what kept me working in agriculture was realizing the, incredible importance it has on climate change and just on our well-being in general.
And
So
those,
initially I went into, oh, sorry,
okay,
go for
no,
it.
and those improvements that need to be made to farming, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Because a lot of the other, industries, transportation, extraction, like there's ways that that can either be eliminated or improved or changed. But with the food system, at the end of the day, you have to grow food. We need it. So
And you were talking about those greenhouse emissions. Is that, I mean, typically I think that it would be more livestock, but is that also in crops growing as well?
yeah. So when I say that the food system as a whole accounts for around one quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world, that includes all farming activities, but also the transportation of the food, the refrigeration of the food, the processing, packaging, all of that, right? So it's everything that it takes to get, I'm sure you've heard from farm to table, everything it takes to get your food onto your plate. That is what it is included in that statistic.
Now, growing up around traditional farms myself, I think, and I think I can say this for a lot of people, that we have this like romantic view of like the big, large farms and the breadbasket of America, if you will, and how that's
Hmm.
feeding the country and whatnot. But traditional farms, they may not be able to meet that goal, correct? Can you talk a little
Correct.
bit about that? Like, why the move from traditional farms to indoor farming?
Yeah, so in my grandmother's generation, she grew up in a small farming community, and her experience of farming was actually closer to that ideal that we think about, right? So they were largely subsistence farmers. They grew what they ate what they grew. Any meat they ate was from animals that they raised, and they did sell meat at markets, and they did, make enough money off of dairy and other things like that in order to go buy the things that they couldn't make, like sugar and flour at the market. But that type of subsistence farming, at least in the US, particularly in North America, which is where my expertise lies, is really not so common anymore. Now, a lot of the outdoor farms are what we'd call like a commodity farm. So there's a lot of monoculture happening, meaning instead of growing a whole variety of plants, you're growing one, right? So this farm grows corn, this farm grows wheat, and you're trying to produce enough corn, enough wheat, or whatever else it is, to feed the growing population. So no matter how efficient you are growing traditional farm or growing traditionally outside, it really doesn't hold a candle to indoor. The population is growing. And we're also experiencing climate change, right? So the knowledge that my grandmother has, while some of it still does apply today, some of it just doesn't account for the extreme weather events that we're having now and the changes that we're experiencing. So with indoor farming, that's where that comes in, right? We need to produce more food, and indoor farms have higher yields than outdoor farms, right? Like we need to produce consistently and reliably. Outdoor farms can mass produce food more consistently, right? Because it's indoors, the environment is much more controlled and less prone to natural disasters than it would be, if you're growing in a field. And as I mentioned earlier, we also need to reduce our carbon footprint. So, if we're able to grow in areas that are closer to cities or where food is harder to grow outside, such as a desert or the Arctic Circle, being able to grow closer to where the people are can reduce carbon footprint from a transportation perspective. There's a lot of really great examples of that in New York City. Gotham Greens, they have a greenhouse that's on top of a Whole Foods. Whole Foods is obviously not the most accessible of grocery stores, but it's about as fresh as you could possibly get in New York City, which is pretty amazing.
So
And
I just want to
Oh,
I
yeah,
just
go
want
for
to
it.
jump in real quick because there's a couple of things that you touched on that I kind of want to circle back to, just so people can get a better grasp of this. So you did talk a little bit. You talked a bit about the sustainability and ecological component that our traditional farms they're not sustainable. They're not good for the environment. I mean, they're growing things, right? So can you talk a little bit about that, like the ecological footprint of a traditional farm for one?
Certainly. So I would never say that indoor farming is always more sustainable or more sustainable on a whole than outdoor farming. It really is a case by case basis. So, for example, like indoor farming as a whole has a lot of major sustainability issues that they're improving, but have a long way to go. So, a good example is if you're growing outdoors, your energy consumption from lighting is zero because you're using the sun, right? If you're growing indoors, you can still use the sun if you have glass or an uncovered roof where you can let the sunlight in. But depending on what type of greenhouse or what type of facility that you're growing in, you need to use energy, right? And the energy is expensive. And depending on your energy source, that could be sustainable or it can be very unsustainable, right? So it really comes down to a case by case basis on like, is this indoor farm more or less sustainable than this outdoor farm? So it's hard to say as a whole if one is better than the other. That being said, outdoor farming also has a lot of impacts on the environment that indoor farming doesn't. So outdoor farming can really impact water systems with, soil runoff. And if you're adding nutrients to the soil, fertilizers, insecticides, anything like that, that gets into the environment and it's a lot harder to control, right? Especially if you're spraying from a plane. I mean, only a small percentage of what you're spraying actually gets on the crop, and the rest is just sort of out in the environment, right? Out in the waterways of the air systems. With indoor farming, you still do need to add nutrients and you still do need to sometimes do crop sprays because insects can get inside, but it's a much more contained environment, right? So any of those sort of negative effects are contained. So really you can kind of go down all these different aspects of indoor versus outdoor farming and say, well, this one's more or less sustainable than the other. But I would say there's a lot of promise in terms of sustainability in indoor farming.
And just kind of to also talk about, like you mentioned, an indoor farm on top of Whole Foods, or that these are coming closer to the city. A couple of weeks ago in my conversation with Nasher Khan, we talked a little bit about accessibility and affordability.
Mm-hmm.
And the lack sometimes of fruits and vegetables or nutritious food in underserved communities or the inner city, or maybe even in some rural areas as well. How can indoor farming kind of help bridge that gap? Like you talked a little bit about it with the Whole Foods indoor farm, but does this mean that we have farms on top of roofs or farms in like, can you kind of explain that? How does that bring it closer to the market, if you will,
Yeah.
indoor farms?
Yeah. So accessibility, you could break that term down in a bunch of different ways. It could be physical accessibility, right? So the Gotham Greens on top of a Whole Foods is physically much easier to access. The food literally goes down an elevator before it's ready to be purchased, right? But Whole Foods is expensive, so it may not be economically accessible. So part of what got me very interested in indoor farming, in addition to the climate impact, is actually the impact on food deserts. So about 30, it's considered a food desert if about 33% of the population in an urban setting is more than 1/2 of a mile from the nearest place where they can get groceries, even if it's like a bodega. If you're talking rural, that's more like 10 miles, but in urban food deserts, they're a lot more common than you would expect. And so we need to make sure to close the accessibility gap both economically and physically. Physically, we actually have a fair amount of indoor farms in New York City. Some of them are in basements, some of them are in warehouses, some of them are on rooftops. Very famously, it's not just New York City, it's also the greater area. Aero Farms is one of the, I would say, more famous indoor farms, and they're right across the way in New Jersey. So physically accessible, that aspect of it is getting better. Economically, there's a long way to go. So if you already shop at somewhere that's like kind of a middle of the road grocery store, like Stop and Shop or something like that, Safeway, you're already buying, no matter where you are in the country, you're already buying produce that's been grown in indoor farms. A lot of the tomatoes in the country are grown in indoor farms.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
I
Tomatoes
had
are probably the number one in terms of percentage. I don't know the exact percentage, but tomatoes are a big one.
uh,
Leafy greens, such as like lettuce, salads, that would be the second.
wow, I mean, I had no idea. I just keep thinking like big fields of tomatoes and lettuce. I
Yeah.
had no idea that they were growing in indoor farms.
Mm-hmm.
And on that kind of note, though, that you were talking about farms in basements, farms in apartments, farms. So okay, is are we talking about greenhouses, or are we what, like when I think of an indoor farm, I think of like, I've always thought of like a greenhouse, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the way you're explaining it or you're talking about it, it's much more than that. What can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, indoor farming is such a broad term. Um, as you mentioned, it could be anything grown indoors, right? So, like a basement indoor farm is an indoor farm. A multi-acre, hundreds of acre greenhouse is also an indoor farm. A term that I use more often is CEA, so controlled environment agriculture. That is more specifically targeted to indoor farming that is technology based, a technology based approach to farming. So that is when we talk about like the greenhouses, the vertical farms. Those types of indoor farms in the CEA industry are the ones that are producing the vast majority of the produce that we are eating. And so when I say, you go to a Stop and Shop and you're already buying leafy greens from an indoor farm, you just don't realize it because they're not quite marketed that way. I mean, not that many people have like, oh, this is my favorite lettuce brand. You kind of just like pick what's there. um, but there are also plenty of very small, shipping container farms, right? Those are not the ones that are going to feed, all the people in the food system. Those are usually they're very situational. So, for example, a lot of First Nations communities in the Arctic Circle use shipping container farms, and that's enough for them to, feed their community, but they're not going to be exporting food to anywhere else, right? In New York basements, and it sounds that sounds like, I don't know, creepy somehow, but there's plenty of, very beautiful, very high tech underground farms in New York. Those are usually producing very high margin foods, such as like edible flowers and like very specific kind of fancy varieties of peas or things that are going to the Michelin star restaurants, right? Because you're not going to make money. These are businesses at the end of the day, right? You're not going to be able to make enough money to pay your New York rent if you're selling, leafy greens for, $3.99. It's going to have to be something a little bit more specialty. But to get to your other question about what is an indoor farm, there's two main components, I would say. If you're growing horizontally, that's usually the greenhouses, right? That could be trays, pots on the floor. You could grow in ponds and gutters. And a vertical farm is, that could be stacked trays. It could be towers. It could be food on the wall, right? There's a bunch of different orientations to how you could be growing the plants.
Yeah, that's what I normally think of. But
Yeah.
but we've talked about that before, where it's not just things growing on a wall, but now there are different types of vertical farming, correct? There are there are some that are just, if I'm not mistaken, it's like the roots are just hanging or so can you kind of explain that a little bit? Like how does a plant grow without soil? How does it grow with that just fascinated me.
Yeah. So most of the farms in the controlled environment agriculture industry, right, the CEA industry, most of them are hydroponic. So what that means is that you're growing plants using a water-based nutrient solution rather than soil. So the plants themselves, there's a bunch of different kind of ways you could grow these plants. They could be on a raft in a pond, right? That's called deep water culture. It's literally like their roots are suspended in the water and they're floating on a pond. There's also nutrient film technique, NFT, which then took on a whole new meaning recently. But that's when you have plants in gutters, kind of these channels where the roots are hanging down. So with hydroponic, there is, either a stream of water running past the roots or the roots are in a pond of water. And so they're only taking up the water and the nutrients in that water that they need. It's soilless, and so it has a lot less of an impact. It's really just water and then whatever nutrients that you add to that water. And you can make sure that you really dial it in so that rather than outdoor soil, which has a whole bunch of things that plants need, but also a whole bunch of things that they don't. And it's very difficult to dial in exactly, the percentages of phosphorus or whatever else. With indoor farming and hydroponics, you can make sure that the water has the exact percentages that this specific variety of lettuce really wants. And then you could change the system so that it has different percentages for your tomatoes, right? So hydroponics is the vast majority of what I'd say the most common growing technique in CEA. There's also aeroponics. So when you're thinking of those vertical farms where the roots are just like hanging out in midair, instead of having water flowing past the roots, you actually have a nutrient-rich mist that is sprayed onto the roots. So this actually uses up 90% less water than traditional outdoor farming, and significantly less than hydroponics. I'm not sure the exact percentage, but water is an extremely important resource and is, not as renewable as we think it is. And I'm sure everyone's very aware of the droughts across the country and across the world. The Colorado River is drying up and getting a lot of, kind of attention lately for that. And so being able to go with aeroponic farming and 90% less water is a very attractive, option for the future. So those are the two most common.
So on that note, these controlled environments, where that kind of just pops up in my mind in a conversation I had with another one of our colleagues, Nitin Magama, where he's dealing a lot with the unpredictability if that's a word,
Mm-hmm.
the trying to predict, trying to help farmers with the unpredictability of climate change,
Mm-hmm.
of like, yeah, like you were mentioning, droughts or severe storms, or like an example of water with rice, right? Like water at the
Mm-hmm.
wrong time is horrible for rice. Now, you wouldn't be doing indoor rice farms, I guess. But going back to the predictability, is it seems like that's probably one of the biggest value added or bonuses of indoor farming, is that you can control these things that right now with climate change are just completely unpredictable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, having an indoor farm, it the vast majority of indoor farms are not completely removed from the system, right? If
Okay.
it's extremely hot out, it's going to be hotter indoors. You're going to have to work harder to, amp up the AC unit to make sure that the plants are not cooking in there. Obviously, the same, or the inverse. If it's cold outside, you need to amp up the heat to make sure your plants have a temperature that they like. If it's going through drought and you have less access to water, you need water for the system, even if you're not getting it from rainwater. Maybe you're getting it from groundwater or something like that, right? Every indoor farm actually has allocations of how much water they can use if you're in a drought susceptible area. So indoor
Okay.
farms are still impacted by the climate, but not nearly as much as outdoor farms. I mean, outdoor farms, you know, my grandmother used to look at the Farmer's Almanac, and that was a decently good guide of what the weather was going to be that year. And those, it's not to say there's no value in that anymore, but it is just increasingly unpredictable. So so when we think about trying to control the environment, it is much, much, much easier to do indoors, right? We can preset the exact like temperature, humidity, CO2, preset the lighting. We can figure out through experiments what different varieties of plants need and try and give them as close to ideal of what they need as possible in order to maximize production.
So with this predictability that you can now sort of control or have a little bit more control over, all of this seems really technical and probably like going way over my head. So to ensure that these environments are controlled, um, the technological component of that, is that a problem? Is that a barrier to entry? It seems like instead of being a farmer, you might need to be have a
A software
master.
engineer.
Yeah, a software engineer. So
Yeah.
so I mean, not just the technology, but also the lighting that goes into this, I guess.
Hmm.
The, like you said, the water, the nutrients, all of these things seems. I know traditional farms have a lot of inputs, but this seems like on a whole other level. And can you talk a little bit about those challenges
Yeah.
in the industry?
Yeah. Yeah. Many indoor farms are quite technologically advanced. And with all the benefits that that has, it also, with more complexity, there's more opportunity for challenges, right? So one is startup costs. One commercial greenhouse can be tens of millions of dollars just to build it, you know?
Wow.
And costs are rising all around, right? With technology and construction and everything. Electricity we talked about, right? Indoor farms, depending on how they're configured, right? Some can use the sun, but maybe if you're completely closed, then you need to produce 100% of your own lighting, right? And that electricity is expensive. Again, depending on where you get that electricity, that could be either sustainable or not, right? Lighting complexity, we could have, hours of conversation about, and I'm certainly not an expert, but it is difficult to mimic, to figure out the exact lighting conditions that are best for growth and to mimic that. So all of that means it is difficult to start such a complex business. And then once you start it, you need people to run it. And so when we think of like farmers, we think of someone like in a field with a hoe, right? And that obviously still exists. I mean, I've done that, and That's how a lot of farms are still run. But the type of labor that you need to help run an indoor farm ranges from people who are still, or basically operating machines to do the seeding and operating machines that do the harvesting. And it almost feels closer to manufacturing in some ways, right? You still need a grower. The plants are still living and the plants will do what they will do. And some varieties are more of a diva than others. So you still need the growers and all of that knowledge. But a lot of the staff in these large greenhouses are operating machinery. You also need people who are, data scientists. If you think about outdoor farming, right? If you're lucky, depending on the variety, you can get, 1 to maybe 4 crop cycles in a year, right? With indoor farming, I mean, you could get 20 or more depending on the variety. That's, way more data than you would ever get, way more learning than you would ever get in outdoor farming in terms of the number of crop cycles and all the data on each crop cycle that you're gathering. So you're going to need IT people to, collect it and analyze it and draw meaningful conclusions from it, right? So there's a lot has changed in terms of the type of people who run these things. It's a lot closer to a lot of tech companies now than my grandmother's version.
And also you need places to do it.
Yes.
And especially in an urban environment. I mean, real estate is the biggest commodity, right?
Yeah.
And so finding those places to do it. I guess a couple of other things that, just thinking about what you talked about, I guess like temperature and humidity are really important for plants and crops as well. And to control that temperature and that humidity, that seems like that would take a lot of energy as well. And like you said, if it's warm outside or if it's cold outside, now you're constantly having to balance that as well.
100%. The cost of land is obviously less if you're rural. And so a lot of these 50 plus acre greenhouses where it's just miles, I mean, you're just looking out on a sea of green and can't see the end of it. Most of that is still in rural areas, but rather than being maybe in the absolute middle of the country, they're 2 hours outside of some major urban area. So it's still a lot closer to the vast majority of the population than most of the outdoor farms.
So, one of the things that you talked about was basically like the yields are bigger for indoor farming, correct? Which means a lot more data. But do you have any like idea of like ballpark, like how much more greater they are for yields, or like is it a big number? You know, is that, and do they base that on like per acreage, or I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It'd be very difficult to say broadly because it would be on a variety by variety basis. So not every plant grows optimally indoors, right?
Okay.
The reason that tomatoes and leafy greens and various sort of vine vegetables are the ones that you most commonly see in a greenhouse is because we've figured out how to optimize for those plants, and those yields are much, much higher than outdoors. I mean, tomatoes in particular are very, very finicky plants. They are very prone to disease. They're prone to, just fungus and rot. They could bleach if there's too much sunlight. They're very sensitive. And so being able to grow them indoors, you have a much better outcome and higher yields than you would outdoors. But something like wheat or a potato, any root vegetable, I mean, those really outdoors is still the way. Part of it is economics, right? Outdoor farming has a lot of subsidies, and particularly staple foods have a lot of subsidies. And so it is economically makes more sense to grow corn and potatoes and wheat outside. With the next farm bill, we're hoping to see more inclusion of indoor farms. And so maybe there can be some help there. The hope is that there's going to be some help from the government to help make indoor farms more viable, economically viable across a larger variety of crops. You can't, feed a population only on leafy greens and vegetables, right? You still need the staples. So, in short, indoor definitely higher yields for a lot of different varieties, but it would have to be a case by case basis.
So on that note, you mentioned the farm bill.
Mhm.
Is that the next big thing for indoor farming, or are there some like technology innovations that are coming, or what's on the horizon for indoor farming?
Yeah, I think automation is a big one. A lot of these processes indoors are automated now, but there's always improvements. I think a lot of people, they think of automation, they think, oh, robots are doing everything and now we don't need people. But oftentimes, automation just means doing things that people can't do to give them either access to more data or to give them access to a particular part of the plant that they can't normally see, things like that, to help humans apply their expertise and make more of a data informed decision. So I would say automation is a big one. I think I've mentioned this a few times, but farming is always a business unless you have a hobby farm, which are lovely, and I hope to have one day. But we need to make sure that indoor farming is economical, right? With the astronomical price of construction and even labor, especially like more tech savvy labor, it's just very expensive, right? And so you there is a tendency for greenhouses to want to cater to the Whole Foods and the Michelin star restaurants with specialty varieties and, kind of these high margin, expensive, rare varieties. And that's great. But we also want to make sure that we're still, making enough food to supply, the stop and shops with, an affordable mix of salad, right? Uh, Very famously, vegetables, any kind of fresh vegetable or fruit is much more expensive than a lot of highly processed food for a whole number of reasons that that would take a whole nother podcast to even scratch the surface of. But we need to make sure it's more economical, because if it's not, then no matter how sustainable it is, or how great it is for the environment, it's not going to advance. And I would say the last one, we talked about the farm bill, right? That's part of being more economical. We're hoping to see, more funding going to the support of indoor farms in the 2023 Farm Bill. It happens every 5 years, so it's very exciting that it's coming in 2023. The last one was in 2018. Indoor farming has changed dramatically. I mean, the world has changed dramatically since 2018, right? Farming has had to change dramatically. So we're hoping that 2023 Farm Bill is a lot more aligned with kind of the future of farming. And I think the last one would just be expansion of tech roles in agriculture. Um, Millennials, Gen Z are attracted to tech, but they're also concerned with our planet. And my hope is that we can attract more young people into ag tech. And, for me, I live in New York City. I make a decent, living working from home. And when people hear that I work in agriculture, they're usually very shocked because I'm not, in the middle of nowhere on a farm using a hoe. So I'm hoping that this industry as a whole can become, just more like normalized and even desirable for my generation, for the next few.
Well, I mean, that's awesome. I mean, I for one, had a very limited scope of indoor farming, and certainly in the urban context. And I think definitely getting more millennials and also more inner city youth involved in this, I think would be great. I've got just a couple more minutes, and I wanted to throw something at you completely different before we wrap this up. Just in my research in for this conversation, I came across that you are a primatologist, or you were a primatologist. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, just real briefly, like just your love for primates and
Yes.
what just a little backstory on that. I just thought that was really cool that people might want to know.
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking me about that. I haven't been asked about that in quite a while. So part of what I loved about farming is working with the animals, and I worked on some primatology projects. Primatology is the study of primates, and I started out doing primatology projects at the Franklin Park Zoo in Boston. I was studying captive gorillas and understanding their cognition and behavioral ontogeny, studying them. And then I transitioned from that to working in the Peruvian Amazon outside of a very remote research base. And I was studying emperor tamarins. I don't know if you've ever seen one. If you haven't, please Google image it, because they have these beautifully curled and coiffed mustaches that apparently looked like some emperor, I think, in Germany, and that's what they're named after. They're very fascinating because they're polyandrous, which means they're the opposite of like a gorilla or a lion pride. So they have one head female, and she has a harem of males, and she always gives birth to twins, and then they all just take care of them for her, and then she just shows everyone where the food sources are. So
Really?
it was, yes.
Wow. Wow. That's, you said it's poly what?
Polyandrous.
Polyandrous. And
Yeah.
it's called the Emperor Tamarin.
Emperor tamarin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I spent months following this one family, and they accepted me, and I was able to study not just their behavior but also their parasitology. So they are resistant to a lot of tropical diseases that kill humans, and so by collecting their poop samples and understanding what they eat, we were trying to identify what in their biome um, can we potentially learn from and maybe use to help humans become more resistant to diseases.
Wow. You're amazing, Kelly. I always love our conversations because I learn so much from you. And so on that note, thank you so much for joining me today. And I really appreciate it. I loved our time when we were at Columbia SIPA chatting, and I just was kind of like a sponge around you, learning from you. So I had no idea about the primatologist component, or maybe that skipped my mind from being overwhelmed. But
well, living in New York, it doesn't come up that often. But no, right back at you. I mean, I loved our time at SIPA together, and I absolutely love having conversations with you that range a whole variety of topics. So we should do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kelly, and we will, I guess, meet at an Irish pub sometime and get some pub food. Yep. All right. Well, thanks, Kelly. Bye.
Take care.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like and subscribe. You can subscribe by clicking the thumbnail on the screen. And last, if you want to hear the audio version of this and future conversations, then subscribe to my podcast on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Thank you, and see you soon.